wait the few seconds just to check. I think we're good. Okay, cool. So, Dark Bleatings, everybody. I am here today with Summer Canon, who I'm sure you're all going to be very familiar with. I know Summer best for despicable works of excellent horror fiction. I suspect she's also a werewolf, but we'll get round to that a little bit later. And Summer, if you don't know, is the Imagine award-winning author of Your Mind that was released by French Press Publishing. This is going back 2 years, that book, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it feels like yesterday to me because I'm still telling everyone about it. So welcome and thank you for being here after our technical difficulties and whatnot, Summer, as well.
Thank you for me.
Cool. So, for anyone who is like uninitiated, do you want to talk a little bit about what kind of fiction you write?
I like to write it's a little all over the place when I'm doing shows and people come up and all my books are out and they say, well, what do you write about? I have to kind of go through a spiel that I do write different stuff. The only thing that's kind of central to everything I write is my main characters are almost always women. I think actually always women. Like I have written works that have absolutely no supernatural elements to them at all. I have written things that are a little more weird, fairy tales, dark fairy tales maybe. And I do love witches. As much as I love werewolves, I've written maybe a little more about witches.
Yeah, your take on witches made me so happy because I am forever complaining that I absolutely love witches as a subgenre, but it's quite hard to find adult witch horror because I find that most of the witches that I find are in like YA stories or things that aren't really like straight up horror stories. So I've read a lot more nice witches, if that makes sense. Nice witches battling the dark arts, and I do also really like that. But sometimes you just want, some nice dark devious witchcraft.
Want it now sometimes, and I do like. I have a particular soft spot for urban fantasy witch series books. Like I love the oh my god, I forget her name. She wrote the Dark Out. I'm gonna forget the name of the titles. Give me 1 second. They're right over here. I'll be right back.
Okay.
Kim Harrison. The Kim Harrison witch books. I was trying to say Rachel Harrison. I was like, no, that's a completely different author. Kim Harrison. And I love Jay Wells' her Prospero's War series too.
Yeah, there's so we'll start with Your Mind since we've already mentioned it, and I don't want to spoil that for anyone who hasn't read it, but I always recommend that to people who are looking for witchcraft, but like very nasty adult horror. I would put that in the camp of if it's not splatterpunk, it's definitely verging into that sort of territory with because it gets quite visceral towards the end. So yeah, without spoiling anything about what happens in that book, can you talk a little bit about the process as you were writing it of sort of like where you decided to take the third act? Because I was so surprised.
I agonized with the layout of this book. I'd gotten to a point where it was all written out. And there is a point in the way it was published where there is a hard right turn. Hard right turn, where the story is going one way and then it goes, ah! And everybody who has read it has been like, oh my God, that went weird. What I was originally going to do was kind of shuffle everything together where we would have flashbacks. We would have where the second part of the book would be the present, and the first part of the book would be flashbacks. And I was going to have, and it ended up not working. And I knew I was taking a gamble with that hard right turn because it is jarring. It means that the first part of the book is maybe a bit of a slow burn. I'm telling you a story, I'm building something up so that then I can Godzilla style just destroy what I've built up. And it is something that I agonized over for a very long time. And I had my fingers crossed when I sent the book to you and Mr. Stephen Kosniewski, because I wondered if that hard right turn would end up working.
Oh, it's so good. I'm really happy that you decided to tell the story the way that you told it, because the impact, and also, so there are two things that happen in this book that are just massive shocks. So we have this teenage couple, and witchcraft is afoot. They're sort of interested in this, and then something happens that is so shocking. I'm trying to think of a good comparison for like level of shock. Oh, I know. For people who've seen Hereditary, there's the post. That level of shock that you get, you're like, oh, I thought I knew what kind of story I was reading, and it has. But it was great because I was really enjoying the story, and I was like, looking forward to seeing where it went. But then because of where you took it in that first instance, I was like, oh, all bets are off now. I've She could do anything. I have no idea what's going to happen, and it really like really opened the plot like back out, like outside of what you thought you were reading. And then there's another layer on top that comes a little bit later, and I was like, oh, cool. So we're not strictly adhering just to sort of one subgenre here anymore either. So it was just such a good. I don't know. I just thought it was really ballsy what you did.
I'm glad it came off that way. That wasn't how I was feeling when I was writing it. I was like, it was constant doubt because I knew I was going somewhere different. And it was like, oh, this either works or it doesn't, plain and simple.
Mhm.
And when it comes to making sure you don't know what's coming, I think it's very important for us as storytellers to not be trustworthy. You don't want your readers to be comfy and cozy and knowing how it's going to end. It
Mhm.
might be a happy ending, it might not be. It's very important that we keep the reader guessing how it's going to end, because that is something as a reader that I find frustrating when I read certain authors and they always go one way.
Yeah, I find that because I read a lot because well, just as a hobby, but also I'm sent a lot of review requests and stuff, and I read a lot of I notice trends in what's popular because of the review requests I get, so I kind of like know, generally speaking, where the horror crowd kind of are, if that makes sense. And also because I studied script writing, and there was like a story analysis element to that course where now I feel like I can see setup because I learned how to do it. And then now, so when something like what you did comes along, it is so refreshing to me, because I'm not saying that like usually everything's boring or anything, but generally if I'm like, oh, okay, I've worked this out, I'll still enjoy the story, but I much prefer to be completely taken off guard. So, and it's not even like it wasn't set up that you could do what you did. It's just uh I just didn't see it as it was happening. But like on a reread, I was like, oh, there are pins being set up to be hit over here, but yeah, you just don't see it as you do it on a first time read.
And you don't necessarily see the ball flying at them all the time. It is very sudden.
Yeah. What kind of do you have favorite witch horror stories that you've read or in film?
The witch stories that I love the most tend to be folklore. I grew up in West Virginia. I grew up in Appalachia, and witch folklore is very strong there. And actually, there were two books written by an outsider, but it was an academic who came to Appalachia, mainly West Virginia, and she collected the folklore stories and put them into two books. One of them called The Telltale Lilac Bush, and the other called Coffin Hollow. And this woman's name was Ruth Ann Musick. And they're scary stories. But we were encouraged in elementary school, like as soon as we learned to read, to start checking these books out of the library. And it was our heritage as Appalachians. And we were encouraged to read these books. And I became obsessed. I became obsessed with, they had these black and white scratchy drawings on the inside, very rough, very crude. Some of them were very gory. There was one of a man standing over his brother with an enormous scythe, cutting his head off. And I remember just being a very tiny child, staring at this picture, being like, wow. And I loved these stories, and not all of them contained witches. Actually, very few of them did. It was mostly things in the woods and ghosts, but there were witch stories, and I loved them. Those are the ones that really stuck with me. And in movies, I'm trying to think. I always found witches enjoyable, even in their hokey moments. Like, I
Mhm.
love the show Bewitched,
Mm.
but I'm confused by that show because I'm always on Endora's side. I think Samantha should have dropped a house on Darren because he wanted her, he took this woman who was a powerful witch in her own right, in her own land. She's famous. It has a certain bloodline that makes her powerful, and she became a housewife, and he won't let her use magic to vacuum. I would have murdered him.
Yeah, yeah, I'm with you on that. um, yeah, witches are they're so interesting, and I feel like I don't know, there's so much scope for what you can do. So when I read something that does something different, I'm happy because even though it's like unlimited possibilities, but people kind of tend to stick to one road with witches, I've found. Um, I live in Wales in the UK, and I excitedly looked up, Welsh folklore witches, dying to know what I'd find because Celtic folklore tends to be like really cool, and I found that the Welsh traditionally didn't believe in witches. So I was so disappointed because I was like, oh, fairies though. There's a whole thing about fairies in Wales, so I was like, okay, maybe I'll switch my attention to that. That's sort of adjacent.
The Welsh, the Welsh are well represented in Appalachia, and the fairy beliefs exist there still. It's a lot of Scotch Irish and a lot of Welsh, and it's such a muddled mess sometimes, but us hardy mountain folk made sense of it somehow.
That's really. I'm gonna have to pick some of that up because it sounds really cool. But oh yeah, I just can you remember what your first entry into witches was? Was that folklore that you?
It was my grandmother. My grandmother was a witch.
How cool!
The mountain granny witch.
Mhm.
It is still a thing in those mountains. It is still a thing. It's weird because it's an amalgamation of so many different things, because the use of Christianity built into it, the use of Bible verses mixed in with certain healing elements.
Mhm.
It's very strange, but it was a lot of writing things on paper, candles. It was a lot of herbs and mixing things. It was mostly for healing, but there were the naughty, angry things too.
Yeah. Well, I remember when. So for anyone who doesn't know, I work for Steve Kozaniewski, who runs a press called Fresh Press Publishing, who published mine. And I remember when we were talking about the cover, and he like the little pictures inside the books and like the chapter breaks and things like that. He was like. He was like, have a look for some like really cool stuff, but just make sure you don't pick anything that's like insulting to actual witches. And I was like, oh yeah, because again, being where I'm from, I didn't even consider that for a second, that there are people who actually practice around the world, and I was like, oh yeah, and this is a horror story, so we got to be doubly careful not to slander an entire section of people. um, it's cool that you've got sort of roots in like family roots with this, but then what you wrote in this book in particular is so dark.
Well, I think every belief system can be bastardized. I think every belief system can either be taken to be used for good or for bad.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah,
very plain.
I'd say that's true of pretty much all religions and belief systems. There's there are threads you can pull with pretty much everything. Okay, so shifting on to your other loves and things that you like to write stories about. Do you have favorite themes, favorite creatures that you like to work with?
I love, I have never walked past a haunted house story. If I see one, I grab it. I love haunted house stories. I've only written one myself. Um, One full length one. I have a short story that was in my collection last year. But I love, love haunted house stories. They are probably my absolute favorite. After, like, monster stories come after haunted houses.
Interesting. What is it about ghosts and is it like the do you like gothic like traditionally
I
gothic ghost
love
stories or
I love it all. I love it all. If it's a modern day urban apartment with a ghost in it, I love it. If it's an old gothic one, like an M.R. James story, love it. I love them all.
so what is it about those kinds of stories do you think that you're so connected to?
It's it's because I'm a homebody. I'm really, really protective of my space. I'm really, really protective of my sacred area.
Mhm.
And I grew up little bit of like too much sharing here, but I had a bad childhood and my home life was bad. And I remember I had my first panic attack as a child on the bus ride home because I did not want to go home. And when I got older and I was able to get to a place where home was my safe place again, I understood what it meant to have that taken away from you. And
Mhm.
that's what ghost stories do. They take your safe place away from you. And that is a very specific type of horror that is specific to me.
Mhm.
Um, but I also love that they're so tied up in atmosphere. Every horror story is atmospheric in some way. They're very heavy in place. They're
Mhm.
very heavy in aesthetic, and I love that about them.
Yeah, there's I think ghost stories that are done well are so effective. I tend not to pick up ghost stories over other things. Um, but I think Michelle Paver's Dark Matter got under my skin a little bit. I just felt generally creeped out. But I think that this is because I when I first lived alone, when I got my house about 8 years ago now, and it was the first time I'd ever lived completely alone without housemates or parents or a boyfriend or whatever. And I got very precious about like my safe space. And then I just found that certain types of horror I just could not do because I was scared. So home invasion, absolutely not. Couldn't
Yeah.
watch anything or read any home invasion stuff until I met my husband and he moved in because I just had nightmares about it all the time. I think maybe that's why I veered away from haunted houses as well because I just thought no, because my imagination runs riot and I think, oh no, don't corrupt my house with all of this nonsense. Are there any types of horror that you're particularly not a fan of? Any areas where you just kind of don't go there?
I don't like apocalyptic or dystopian horror that much. If it's apocalyptic, I want it building up to the apocalypse, not so much the aftermath, which is why I don't I don't like zombies very much because it's all the world ended. And the thing about zombies, I know they're very popular. I am in the minority. Call me wrong. It's okay. I promise. I understand. I may be wrong here, but it ends up being human drama with monster backdrop.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the monsters are just kind of there to interject to break up the human drama. And I find it frustrating because I don't want the sole focus of what I'm reading to be bad people. That's too close to home for me.
Hmm.
Um, so I'm not a big fan of dystopian and apocalyptic stuff for that reason. I'm not a big fan. There are exceptions. I'll give anything a try. I'm just not a huge fan of like sci-fi stuff, and
Hmm.
there's no good reason for that other than it's not my taste. But everything else, I'll try anything once.
Yeah, I'm trying a bit harder with sci-fi horror specifically, but it depends on how speculative it is. If it's set in space with lots of spaceship jargon and stuff, I'm a bit like I struggle a little bit. If it's something about like a new disease or like that kind of sci-fi where it's a bit more uh plausible for like right now, then I like it a bit more. But totally, I love zombies, but I totally see where you're coming from because I was a die-hard Walking Dead fan for the longest time. But then after a while, the zombies weren't even like they were just walking past her, and I was like, "Hey guys, remember when you used to do entire episodes about one zombie's got through the fence or something?" And yeah, the human drama, and everyone always does suck in those stories. It's I find them anxiety inducing now.
I do too. That's the thing. And my husband's favorite is zombies. He's complete opposite of me. So I watched the first season of The Walking Dead with him, and then I was like, "You're on your own. I got to get out of here. I can't take this anymore. This is not for me." And I mean, again, obviously in the minority because it was a huge hit, but it was not for me.
I got excited about the first spin-off they announced where they said, okay, so we started with the apocalypse or like the aftermath in The Walking Dead, and now we're going to give you a show that shows you like the run up to it. So I was really excited, but then they do a whole show where you see like one zombie and then you're waiting to see everything crumble. And then they ended the season and started the next one after it all happened. And I was like, well, that is not what you promised. I wanted to see everyone go down. Or like see how it happens at least. But I guess maybe they were writing and they thought, oh, can't really think, so they
There is
skipped ahead.
there is the odd story that gets through. I'll never be able to remember the name, but I can tell you that there have been short stories that featured zombies that I really liked.
Mm-hmm.
And talking about apocalyptic stories, The Stand
Mm-hmm.
remains one of my favorite books of all time. And I think it has to do because that's a very specific Stephen King thing where the world is ending, everything is going all to hell, but it's still very human centric. And Stephen King, I think, despite outward appearances, is kind of an optimist when it comes to people. You
Mm-hmm.
get the brotherhood and the coming together, and there is that optimistic point of view throughout, even when things are going absolutely down.
Yeah, that's what I like about his work as well, because you're reading horror stories, but they're not he's very rarely bleak. I get like the wholesome feel from his characters where they're all flawed, but you like really feel the friendships and the relationships and everything. And it does, I find that Stephen King doesn't tend to end things horribly, so I feel relatively safe until he does every now and then, and I'm like, oh, Stephen,
Yeah.
how dare you?
You'll read a short story of his and be like, oh my gosh, that's not you.
Yeah,
What
that's
happened?
where he gets you, is with the shorts. Or I guess the Richard Bachman stuff was a bit meaner spirited, but that's not very many of his works. So um, yeah, this is what leads me nicely to. I was going to ask you if you have authors that influenced you earlier on before you started writing, so just people you like to read, and if those have changed over time as you've like progressed through your own writing.
I think there are certain elements of me, like foundational aspects that are kind of set in stone at this point. One of them is definitely Stephen King. But the other one is an author who was prolific in the 80s and early 90s named Ruby Jean Jensen. And I happened upon her because my grandmother, who was an enormous influence in my life. My grandmother was a horror fan. I grew up with women being the horror fans. The men in my life really weren't. They weren't interested. So my grandmother and my mother were both big horror fans, but my grandmother was also a hoarder.
Mhm.
It wasn't quite as bad as those that you see on TV, but there was a element of stacks, and you had to kind of meander through stacks of things. And one of the things that she tended to over collect were paperbacks, old paperbacks. And I would go to her house, and her home was like an escape for me. You could find peace there. And one of the things that was peaceful was going through those stacks of books, going through those stacks of paperbacks and finding ones that I wanted to read and going through them. And one day, I was very young, I was maybe 10. I found this book by Ruby Jean Jensen, never heard of her, called The Haunting. And I read it, and it was a fairly thick paperback. It wasn't a small one, but this book scared the crap out of me. I took it home with me, and I would read it in bed at night, and I would be scared if I had to go to the bathroom or to get water. I was scared to put my feet on the floor because maybe there was something under my bed. And that's not something that happens to me. I'm not afraid of the dark. I'm not afraid of anything. I don't need night lights. But that book put me on edge. And it's been a high that I continue to this day to chase with her because I'm still going through her books. I've read a lot of them, and every one of them has been really good, has had some sort of element to it where I've been kind of shocked. And at this point in my life, nothing should be shocking me, but she does, because she was a woman who was writing paperbacks in a time where it was mostly men writing.
Mm.
And she was writing works that were distinctly female. And she wasn't afraid to be brutal. She
Mhm.
murdered children in her books, tortured children in her
Mhm.
books, and they're well written. The stories, there are some of these stories where you look at because infamously paperback covers from that time are ridiculous.
Mhm.
Um, you think of Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door with the skeleton cheerleader. It has nothing to do with the story. She,
Yeah.
she has one book called Chain Letter, and the the cover is a skeleton in a mailman's outfit holding a letter out, and it looks ridiculous. And to be perfectly honest, the premise of the book, if I were to give it to you baldly, it's ridiculous. The book has no right to be as good as it is.
I'm gonna have to check her out because I hadn't even heard of her, but I'm really excited. um yeah, I find I've actually gone out of my way to read more female authors the last couple of years, because even though I am myself a female author, I didn't realize until I did sort of my end of year stats the first year I launched my website, that I was disproportionately reading way more men, um, and male lead characters as well. And I think I don't think that there's a difference in quality of horror between men and women, like nothing that I've noticed, but there are definitely um, different types of stories being told. I don't like draw a line and say, oh, men write like this and women write like this, but I found a lot of, especially recently, sort of more psychological horror. I've read a lot of horror about pregnancy and parenthood, for example, sort of like mother's perspective kind of stuff. Um, and a lot of really deep stuff as well about things like postnatal depression, or health treatments and medical things at the time, for like say in the 50s for women and stuff, things like the yellow wallpaper of that stayed with me for a really long time.
Oh, yeah.
um, I think, yeah, I think every every person in any background has got a whole like I don't want to say treasure trove. I was going to say treasure trove of trauma to mine from, but it's true. Everyone's got their different sort of experiences that you can turn into a horror story, because some of it isn't too far off in the first place.
Yeah.
Um, who do you like to read at the moment? Have you found anyone new that you would consider an influence?
Yeah. Yeah, actually, yeah. I read a book last year. I blurbed it. I actually just talked about this. I blurbed this book early last year. And when I came to the end of the year talking about all the books that I did, this book stuck with me, and I didn't see it get a lot of attention. It's called The Wicker Witch by Cheryl Lowe.
Hmm.
And oh, it had all the elements that I love. It's it's spooky, it's atmospheric. So it takes place on, it might not be an Appalachian story, but it reads like an Appalachian story. Um, a storm isolates a group of people who live on a mountain, and they're isolated up there with something ancient, something mean, something that messes with them. And some of it's a slow burn, some of it is not. It really threads a lot of tension that already exists between these families, and it threads a lot of, there's something very wrong up here. The people who leave and move off of this mountain, they can't come back. There's something wrong with the place, and
Hmm.
what that is making it wrong is this thing. And I read this book and it knocked my socks off, and I didn't see it get talked about a lot. So on my YouTube channel, I made special mention of it again at the end of the year, saying, please, nobody talked about this book. Check it out. The Wicker Witch by Cheryl Lowe. Fantastic book. I also recently, this is not a newer author. I don't know if Cheryl Lowe is either. She's not super active online, so I can't find out too much about her. But Cherie Priest. I
Hmm.
read her book, not Cinder Witch. It was the other one, but I want to read Cinder Witch. I'm so bad with titles. This is a me thing. My brain is a sieve. But her book was awesome, awesome. And these books are also, endings with books can be a bit of a toss up. You have to be forgiving of endings that don't necessarily hit a perfect note, because endings are hard.
Oh yeah.
But these two nailed both the endings, nailed them.
Yeah, I appreciate a perfectly executed ending because, truthfully, most books don't end perfectly, even though as a reader I couldn't say what perfect to me would be. Um, but I think most people do well enough with them. But when you find a glorious ending, so so refreshing. Um, so in terms of your own style, because I know that you don't just stick to one thing. And a perfect example, because jumping out of some of your darker stuff, um, you have contributed a werewolf story that we can't talk about too much because the book is coming out soon, but it isn't quite out yet. And from the title alone, oh, sorry, this is for a werewolf anthology called Strange New Moons, that I co-edited, and I was very excited to get your story in to read because I know that you like werewolves as much as I do, or maybe more than I do. And the title of your story just threw me so much because I don't know what I was expecting you to send, but the title is, wait, what is it? I'm going to say it wrong. Can you say it?
I might say it wrong, so just it's long. It's Who Keeps Shitting on the Memorial Fire Tower.
That's it. I just thought, okay, we I was so delighted because I was excited for whatever you said, but I really had convinced myself that you were going to go like really serious with it for some reason. Um and then it turned out to be like a really humorous story with, the toothiness that you want in a werewolf story. Um and I felt happy because I also wrote sorry, that's the sound of a ladder.
My bad.
So it's my husband emerging from the attic where I keep him. Um, yeah. I had also gone comedic with my story, and I was feeling quite alone as the submissions were coming. I was like, oh, I hope somebody else takes a different angle. And then I was like, oh, good. And it was just it was just such a funny idea. Yeah, I don't know what we can say about it because the book's not out yet. And as I started talking about it, I realized that. So that's my bad, really. Sorry, everybody. But yes, look forward to reading Summer Story in that anthology when it's released, because it was it was one of my highlights. And the more time that passes, the funnier I find it. I don't know why. It's just really tickling me more and more as time goes on whenever I think about it.
So years and years ago, I read a werewolf anthology. Back when nobody was talking about werewolves, it was still when zombies were the big thing. I'll be damned if I can remember the name of the story or the anthology, but there was a story in there where he was kind of a trashy guy, trashy, icky man. You wouldn't want to touch him with a 10-foot pole or you'd catch something.
Mhm,
He notices an itch
mhm,
and he starts kind of raging about it because he can't make it go away. And he starts to suspect that it might be something he contracted from like a sex worker.
mhm.
And the rage starts turning into something else and he starts transforming. And he's like, all right, so I contracted this from this sex worker. I'm going to go find her. And he goes to confront the sex worker. And the sex worker has already transformed into a werewolf. He scares him off. Doing it justice, I was on my floor laughing hysterically because the story was done so good. And I am a serially unserious person. I am incapable of taking myself too seriously. I am far too flawed. And I love leaning into the absurdity of horror sometimes because there are elements of horror that are so silly. And if you take it all too seriously, sometimes it loses its punch. So if you make fun of yourself, if you make fun of the genre sometimes, it's almost like a breath of fresh air. It's almost like a breather where you can go back into the serious stuff and it hits harder.
Mhm. Yeah, I think humor and comedy just really goes hand in hand with horror, because it's I don't know, it's a very emotive genre, and sometimes you want a little bit of a laugh mixed in, which is,
Yeah.
I always appreciate a funnier story in a horror anthology, because sometimes it can feel a bit relentlessly dark, and then you
Yeah.
break it up. Um, with werewolf stories, because I feel like, I know they are popular. It's not like people don't like werewolves, but if you compare them to zombies and vampires, there is far less to find. I went on a bit of a werewolf story hunt about 18 months ago, and I found it surprisingly difficult compared to how easy it is to find 100 zombie books just at the drop of a hat. What do you think it is about this particular subgenre that people, I don't say are less interested in, but is it? Do you think that people have struggled to find different angles on it?
I do. I think people want to take a werewolf a little too much at face value as just kind of a raging testosterone fueled monster.
Mm-hmm.
Um, That's why I think Ginger Snaps, the movie, was so refreshing because they took the very obvious parallel of a menstrual cycle and
Mm-hmm.
tied it in with lycanthropy, the moon cycle, and everything like that. But there's a lot more to a werewolf than just a man going through being turned into an animal and losing touch with his human side, which in itself is also interesting. Losing touch with your humanity and turning into something that you have no control over, hurting things you care about. That's one thing. But this there's two ways to tell a werewolf story. Either you're the one experiencing the change, and
Mm-hmm.
that's a kind of horror, body horror, psychological loss of self horror, but then you're the person who is the hapless victim who is
Mm-hmm.
wandering about in werewolf. That there's two different kinds and they can both be made funny, they can both be dead serious, and there's more to it than just werewolf runs the woods.
Mm-hmm.
There's more to it, and I think people sometimes don't get that, and I think that's why werewolves tend to do well in the fantasy genre. There are a
Mm-hmm.
lot of like the werewolf cabal that runs South America. There's a lot of stories like those. I don't particularly care for those as much. I want my werewolf to be a monster, not a mafia. But
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously for the sake of the anthology, I read like 300 submissions, and annoyingly most of them are really good. It wasn't even like I could just put a pile automatically on the no pile. It was agonizing deciding from the open submissions, but um an easier way for me to sort of decide as I was going through was if it was what I would call a standard werewolf story. So a really well written story about someone struggling with the other side of their personality or whatever it was, or then, you know, a werewolf in space. Like, you know, like, do you know what I mean? Like something like a little bit different. I think yours is one of the only stories that isn't from the werewolf's perspective, which made it interesting. And obviously, the perspective it's from was comical to me. They those guys reminded me of friends I had in uni when I was in university, so I could really see it. Um, yeah, I think that werewolves are just generally done a bit dirty, and people write them off. But there's so much scope. I think my funniest werewolf joke that I ever saw in anything was in an episode of True Blood. They're in human form but having an argument, and then she just turns to one and goes, "Oh, stop growling." Because he's just like growling behind. And it was like, I was like, is anyone going to mention that he's growling? Because it's ridiculous. I was like, oh, okay, good.
that show, like, I love those. I love those books, but that show got silly. I remember that scene you're talking about where it's Sookie. She turns around to Alcide and is like, "Quit
Yeah,
growling," because he's
yeah, he's like,
doing this.
yeah, I did. I was going to ask you. So I was going to ask you if you're a fan of these kinds of shows where, obviously, the initial thing with True Blood is vampires, but they've got a bit of everything in there. And I wondered where the line for you was, where it just went ridiculous, because everyone has a different line for where they found it silly.
I didn't immediately like the show because I'm so devoted to the books, and the show
It's quite different.
it was the first season tried to it tried to match the tone with Charlene Harris, right? And then by the second season they're like, no, the first season was a hit, let's do our own thing.
Mhm.
And the books are told from the perspective of Sookie Stackhouse. And the show completely stopped making her the main character at one point. It was all about everybody else's story. And I don't care
Yes.
about them.
Yeah.
And the thing is, the best thing to come out of that show was oh my God. Again, my brain is a sieve. The cook,
Oh,
the sassy
Lafayette.
Fayette, thank you. The best thing to come out of that was that performance because he's a flash in the pan character in the books,
Yeah,
and
I
they
remember.
they wonderful in the show. I watched until the end of the fourth season, and then I was like, I can't do this anymore. This has gotten stupid, and I never finished it.
Oh my gosh, if you thought it was stupid by the end of the fourth season, you should have seen the final season. It was crazy. Um, can you remember like the final scene of Blade?
Yes.
You know, with like the vampire gods and stuff? That's kind of where they went. I was like, oh my gosh, what is happening? um, do you like anything? I'm gonna go ahead. This is me assuming, but did you like Buffy back in the day?
Didn't know.
Wow.
Oh, here's the thing. I didn't watch it when it first ran. And I had enough friends going, "You're this person, you're the scary person. Why don't you watch Buffy? You'll trust me, you'll like it." I was much older
Mhm.
when I did actually sit down and try to watch it. And it had its charm. It definitely is a bit of a charm bomb because everybody in it is so darn adorable. Um, I got to where everything goes weird and she suddenly has a sister and
Oh yeah.
I lost interest. I was like, this is becoming much too melodramatic. I stopped liking Xander. Like everything about him was icking me out, and I fell out of love with it real fast.
Xander is that character that in hindsight everyone's like,
Yes.
I don't know about this guy. um, yeah, I was gonna ask you. Yeah, I was just curious about if you enjoyed those kind of like mixed subgenre shows because you mix in your own work quite a bit.
I
Um,
do. A show I do love, and I'm actually rewatching it now, is Supernatural. I
Me too.
love Supernatural. Love that show.
I'm rewatching it right now, and I just passed the wishing well episode with the
Oh,
babe.
really? I'm
Yeah,
7, so that's the season with the Leviathan.
yeah.
So we're in that mess. There are some seasons of that show because it's so long. There's so much of that show. There are whole seasons of that show that are straight garbage,
Yeah,
but
I remember a lot of them. I I watched the Leviathan season on a rewatch. I stopped watching it and I was like, right, I'm gonna restart it because I couldn't remember where I got to. I was like, I'll just watch from the start again. And I do think seasons 1 to 5 are gold, pretty much. And then
yes,
beyond that, it gets very
yes.
iffy. And I got to the very end of the Leviathan season, and then I thought, oh, I did see this, and I didn't even remember as I was watching it that I'd seen it.
It's not great. It's not the best season. Did you ever watch The X-Files?
No, I've been meaning to. Everyone watched it when I was a kid, but it just wasn't on in my house, so I never.
I didn't watch it until I was an adult. Like I was there when it was running the first time, and I never watched it. I watched it as an adult. Now it has a drop where it's fine, it's good, good, good. Maybe not so great, and then it completely drops off in quality. It does for me become unwatchable after a certain. But the thing about Supernatural are all of the X-Files parallels. There are so many episodes where you're like, wait a minute, you're thinking to yourself this particular episode, and you're like, wait a minute, was that X-Files or Supernatural? Because they're so similar in speed, in aesthetic, they're so similar. But the actors, not Mulder and Scully, but other actors, appear all over the place in Supernatural.
Yeah, I the thing I was trying to convince someone to watch Supernatural once, and she said, "Oh no, isn't that show where they just rip other stuff off?" And I was like, "No, you don't understand what they're doing."
I have gotten into arguments with people. I've gotten into arguments with people who were just like, that's just a chick show. They just want you just watch it for the hot guys. And it's like, first of all, no. Second of all, like if this were a show about hot women, there would be so much nudity. There would be so
Yeah,
much like the thing is the show as it is, there is so much zooming in on women's butts, on their cleavage. Like there's so much like objectification of women. And those guys almost never take their shirts off. They cry a lot. And they wear really bad cheap suits a lot, but they're not taking their clothes off. What are you talking about?
yeah. I always think that Supernatural manages to get away with entire seasons of complete garbage because the characters are so likable that I'm like, I'm not really watching it for the plot, to be honest with you. I'm watching for like the character interactions and stuff. And I think that the plots got worse over time, but the characters got better. So um, I will say this though. Oh, my cousin loves Jensen Ackles, and he came here for a Comic Con last year or the year before on her birthday, and I was like, we have to go. It'll be your birthday present. I will buy a photo op with him. And in the queue to get to him, I've gone to lots of conventions, and this was I've never been in a queue like the one for Jensen Ackles because he was behind a screen, so you couldn't see him until you got to him. And everyone in like the closer you got, people were hyperventilating, checking in mirrors, sweating. I was like, this is crazy. God, what is wrong with everyone? And then when I walked around and actually set eyes on him, he's like 10 times more attractive in real life somehow than he is on TV. And I was like, oh, hello, Mr. Jensen. I came home. I was like, sorry, babe, I have to leave you, Jensen Ackles. fun characters and people, and even when the plots are trash, they're still fun episodes. So yeah, it's a comfort show for me.
Oh, yeah. I just love the episode I tried to get people to listen to me on where they're like, oh, it's just a chick show. It's like, no, no, no. It's serious until it's not. There is a full episode where these guys lock Satan and God in a room and make them talk to each other. Like, you have to understand this show does not take itself too seriously. It actually actively makes fun of itself half the time.
Oh yeah, like the episode where they end up on the set of Supernatural.
God.
Such a good one. It's like, what's with these names? And they're just looking at their own careers. Yeah, it's such. Sorry, we got off such a. Sorry, everyone, we got on such a tangent about Supernatural. But if you haven't seen it, you have to see it. So yes, before I have to wrap up with you, I would like to ask you about themes in your own writing, and when you're starting out writing a story, do you know sort of like thematically what you want to do with it, or does that sort of like work its way in on its own, or intentionally over future drafts?
There are some things that are intentional. I think one of the central themes in a lot of my work is angry women. They're
Mm-hmm.
angry for one reason or another. Sometimes it's an injustice, sometimes it's not. Sometimes, she has no good reason to be mad. She's just maybe a bit of a butthole. No, my first draft experience is getting that first draft out. I've described it as vomitous.
Mm-hmm.
it's it's just kind of like a dumping it out, getting it down, and then it's making sense out of it, molding it. Because the thing is I don't outline, I don't plan ahead. It's all very, I'm pantser. I don't know my characters. I
Mm-hmm.
get to know them through the process of writing about them. And then I go back and implement personality quirks and things like that in the beginning as I'm going through subsequent drafts. Um, Nothing is intentional, to be honest. Everything's an accident with me. I am, again, far too flawed to be able to be precious about my writing because it's chaos. That's what it is.
Well, I mean, for what it's worth, it pans out really well for you in the end, though, because your stories are very like they're very tight. Like I'm a nitpicker as well, and I know this is not my most attractive quality, but like I'm so nitpicky. Every time I read a book, I like make notes when I find things that irritate me, like inconsistencies or stuff, which is very unfair because I'll never publish the first novel I wrote because it is a hot mess of plot holes and threads I forgot about and things I should have taken notes on as I was going along. But your stories feel very clean. So I'm interested to hear you say that it's chaos because they don't turn out feeling like that.
So the so the editing process, um, and other writers tend to get worried about me when I talk about my process because they're like, well, that's not nice. But the editing process is very almost kind of like self-abusive. I'm very hard on myself. I'm very hard on that first draft. And like, because I'll do a string of writing where it's very exact and to the point, but there's no writing to it. And
Mm-hmm.
I'll say in my back and write this, make it look good. What's wrong with you? And it's a lot of like, why would you do this? Oh my God, that's not what her name is. Why did you forget this? I'm very hard on myself, and I entertain myself going through this process because my first draft is such a mess. I make myself laugh by being awful to myself. I call myself names in my when I'm doing the editing. Like it's to other people it looks brutal, but I think it's funny.
Yeah, I do that. The number of times I've written "you dumb bitch" to myself on my own edits, where I found something and thought, "What? What was I thinking there? Why did I do that?" Um, isn't it funny how at the time that you're writing, you can be really pleased with a sentence that you wrote, and then when you come back to it later, you're like, "That was not my finest work."
I'll find sentences where I read it out loud and I can't get the words right because it's strung together so poorly. And I'll just circle it and be like, you are the worst writer in the world. Why are you doing this? Go work at the grocery store. That's where you belong.
Yeah, learn a trade, go into
Go get
carpentry.
a job. Be useful because you're not built for this. And again, if I can't tell my friends that I do this because they're like, why are you doing that to yourself? And it's like, I don't mean it.
Yeah, it's just part of the process of getting a finished product. So very lastly, would you like to recommend a piece of your own work for people who've never read you? A starting place.
Never read me.
Yeah.
A good place to start to get kind of a sense of maybe the deepest part of my brain that works on this, the part that really places my id front and center would be my work, Killer Chronicles. It's a short novella. A lot of sense of humor in that one. Not all of my works have a sense of humor. Some of them are serious, but Killer Chronicles is sometimes funny. But that is my personality put most strongly in a book.
Okay, cool. Well, I am going to put your links in the description so people can find you. I'll put the link for Killer Chronicles in there so people can just directly find that as well if they want to check it out. And this has been really fun, Summer. Thank you so much for doing this. And yeah, really grateful that you took the time.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome, and hopefully we can do it again.
Yes, absolutely.
Maybe when your next book comes out and we can do a little promotional something.
Would love that. I would love that.
All right, so for everyone at home, we're going to sign off with our standard sign off. We just wish them all a nice bleat.